Hello everybody, good afternoon. It is 1:03 and I'm Liz Mosley. I'm going to be editing Sensemaker Live this lunchtime. We're going to be talking about, it's the second in a series of conversations we're having about China and China in the world, and how we understand the influence and impact of China and Chinese culture and political decision making and things for those of us who don't live there. Our chosen topic today is about China and COVID, and in particular, how China has managed this awful disease relative to the rest of the world, what we can learn from what's gone on so far, and what we do and don't know, I suppose, as the picture continues to evolve. The pandemic isn't finished yet. And I'm very, very grateful to our two invited experts for joining us today. Andy Mock, who is in Beijing. It's 8 o'clock in the evening in Beijing. And Andy has very kindly offered an hour of his evening to help us navigate this conversation. He's Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. And our other invited expert, Yachia Wang, who is in New York at 8 o'clock in the morning, and is a China research fellow at Human Rights Watch. I'm very grateful to them both, and I will need the help of everybody in the room, because for those of you who are regular attendees of Tortoise ThinkIn, you'll know that I'm not, when it comes to China and COVID, I'm not the A team, I'm not the B team, I might not even be the C team, but for various reasons, I'm the person who is going to do my best to navigate my way through the conversation today. I was really interested in the data that Nimo has pulled together. Nimo, my colleague, is moderating the chat, and we'll come to her to talk through some of those statistics in a second. But to start us off, hi Nimo, to start us off, I'd like to go to Andy, please, if I can. That number that we saw on the screen at the beginning, which really sort of prompted this conversation, 5,179 deaths in China relative to, as we know, nearly 600,000 in the States. Just talk to me a little bit about that number, because in the early part of the pandemic here in the UK as well, we talked a lot about what do we count as a COVID death. So what are the ingredients in that number? What are those 5,179 people? What do we know about it?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Liz. Really glad to be on the show tonight. Looking forward to this conversation, both sharing my views as well as learning more about the perspectives of our other people on the show. I think that this number, of course, is an official statistic, and to put it in context, it is less than 1% of the deaths in the United States, but it's even lower on a per capita basis, because we know that China, as the country with the largest population in the world, about 1.4 billion, that this is, I think, even more remarkable on a per capita basis, and not just in absolute terms. So if you're asking, what is in this number, my understanding is that this is an official statistic that is collected by different levels of government, aggregated, and then of course reported into one national level number. And we could dig into more if you want, but that's my understanding of what that number is.
I'd love to know, there's been some brilliant work done by people over at the FT in the UK who've been calculating data for this country that's called excess deaths. So there's a distinction, I think, between the number of people who die with COVID on the death certificate, I'm talking about UK statistics now, and then people who die within 28 days of a positive test of COVID, but there can be other reasons that they actually died and things. And then there's this other lens, which is looking sort of more holistically about the overall number of people who have died of anything, and trying to get a sense of how much of that was caused by COVID directly or indirectly. Do you have a sense of specifically those 5,179 deaths? Are they people who died sort of in hospital of COVID? Is that the best explanation of what that number represents?
That would be my understanding, but I would say that I am not an expert in this area. So if other people have a more authoritative answer on this, I'd certainly love to hear it, but that is my understanding.
Has there been any investigation, to the best of your knowledge, in China about those other types of tracking? Because again, what the world is coming to terms with is that there's this sort of awful direct impact of COVID, the disease itself, and people not being able to, not surviving it. And then there's all the other impacts, direct and indirect, for public health and economy and all of that stuff. Do you have a sense of how China is sort of tracking and managing the sort of indirect impacts of COVID, particularly on public health?
Again, what I'm most familiar with are these, we could call them headline numbers, numbers of deaths, economic growth rate. If we were to get more granular into the weeds, I'm pretty sure that there are official departments tracking this. I think the main concern is containing what was seen at the time as a potentially catastrophic public health disaster. And we've seen that other countries, the US and India, have suffered much more. But also that in terms of the absolute, even though the numbers that have died have been tragic, this could have been far worse. We can compare it to other types of disease outbreaks in terms of infection rates, in terms of fatalities. So I think that that's the main concern, and that hasn't gone away. We should also be aware of that in China, on the ground today, there still is a lot of vigilance, as we've seen in some cases in Guangzhou, that this isn't seen as complete victory yet, even though enormous progress.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, and I'd love to come on perhaps in a short while to talk about how it is now, to talk about vaccine progress and recent outbreaks and how they're being managed. I think that's really important, that we don't assume that this is all over and what we're looking at is a sort of rear view mirror picture. I think it's clear to me that it's still very live. If we go to Yaqiao now, Yaqiao, you obviously you're not in China at the moment. You're in New York. One of the things that we've observed from a number of perspectives, actually, throughout the past year, when we've been comparing, particularly it taught us the UK performance, if you like, versus other countries. We've talked a lot about this thing that not all lockdowns were created equal. Different countries we use this word lockdown as though we're all describing the same thing, but even city by city, what we actually mean by lockdown is very different. What was the Chinese lockdown? If we go right back to the very beginning, in Wuhan, it's been discovered and there's a sort of containment urgency around it. What was that picture? What was the scenario? And to what extent do you think that affected this extraordinarily low number of fatalities?
Well, I think overall, I would use the word draconian. It's really, tight in Wuhan and in other areas that has outbreak, like in Xinjiang. Let's say, I have a friend who lives in Wuhan. She kept a diary and she posted it online every day, about her life. Basically, she's just in her home, can't go anywhere. So she's waiting for the delivery of food by authorities. So in a way, for her, it's fine. She lives alone. Like in terms of food, she didn't starve or anything. But I think a key component of that kind of lockdown is that you have no agency. You cannot decide for yourself. So you're constantly living in fear, whether the food will deliver to me on time. I have this food at home. Is it gonna be enough for the next 5 days until delivery comes? So this is a kind of lack of control of your own life and fear of that. On the other hand is that, you have no say in terms of when this lockdown will be lifted. So you just live in this situation that you don't know when you can ever go out of home. Again, this, is fear. It's, psychologically impact you. I mean, her diary has a lot about, how do I maintain sanity? How do I calm myself down? She talks about, exercise, watching some entertainment online, stuff like that. Then there are other people who were complaining online about they didn't get enough food. So the delivery was some other, glitch in the delivery, and they were like literally starving. And then, I mean, this is what I observe online. China has a huge censorship issues. So a lot of people are not complaining online because they're worried they're gonna, be harassed by the authorities, or their life would be impacted if they criticize the government. So this just, I would say, the tip of iceberg, people who complain. Then you can see, what's beneath it. So I would say, this is like a general situation. And then there are the people who do get punished for complaining online. There's a woman also in Wuhan. She was harassed and detained later, when the lockdown was lifted, and she got detained because she was criticizing the government online earlier during lockdown.
Yeah, Chiao, that is fascinating. So if I remember back to, in the UK, March the 23rd, and Boris Johnson goes on the TV, I can remember it. It's absolutely specific. I'd moved house that day, so I can really remember exactly where I was and what I was doing. He said, you must stay at home. The rules for this country then were that you were allowed to go out of your house for an hour a day to exercise, and you were permitted to go out for medical reason if you had an appointment or something like, or you need to get medication, and to buy food. So you could go out. It's true. I mean, we all felt horrified, and and I think the vast majority of people observed those rules very carefully, particularly in the beginning. So is it the case that was it just in Wuhan, or was it across the whole of the country that there was a day when suddenly people weren't literally allowed to leave their houses and people were taking them food, or was that a Wuhan specific thing?
I think it's more Wuhan specific, not Wuhan. I think it's still, the rule apply differently in different localities. So if it's around Wuhan, it's tighter. And my family is living far from Wuhan, and they didn't experience that kind of you cannot go anywhere kind of thing. But I mean, in Wuhan, it's definitely that you cannot go anywhere. So there are people sneaking out, and then they get like, literally the government was like, tie you around the train because like in a way of punishing you. Then they also, we saw the video online about the government came over and sealed your door, like literally your apartment gets sealed, so you cannot get out of apartment. So there are those kind of inhumane way to trying to contain you at home.
And Liz, maybe I can.
Yeah, please.
So, because I've been obviously on the ground here in Beijing during the pandemic, at the very beginning of the outbreak. I was also in a rural part of China as well. And what I can say is that Yatu's comment, her description of draconian, I think is not entirely inaccurate. And especially, I think, for Westerners with Western sensibilities, I think it would cross as very harsh. But I think I would also like to add a little bit of detail as well. So in Beijing, I live in a community, what we call the xiaoqu. So think of it as a housing complex with about 30 high-rise buildings. And when the lockdown came, or the decision was made, everyone was issued essentially a passport. So, well, you were not allowed out of your apartment. And then after, I forget, maybe a week or two, we were allowed out, but we had to go through the main gate and show a passport to come in and out. And food was not allowed to be delivered in. You had to pick it up at the gate. So it was very strict, and I think it's not inaccurate to call it draconian, but we have to also recognize that I think many Westerners, especially in developed countries like the United States and the UK, have lived very insulated lives and perhaps in a bubble where they have not faced any true either natural disaster or man-made catastrophe like war, where sometimes very difficult, harsh decisions have to be made about who lives and who dies. And you can imagine, so many people on a lifeboat with only so many that the lifeboat can hold, these types of issues. But I think that it was very strict, it was very fast, and you talk about the difference in interpretation of what a lockdown meant. I think one of the issues or one of the capabilities that the Chinese government has that I think perhaps is unique, certainly at this scale, is the ability to implement almost overnight uniform policies, whether you're in the most rural part of China or you're in the heart of Beijing or Shanghai.
And when you say implement, what is it about the setup that makes that possible that it's not possible here? Is it to do with the established relationship between the authorities and the people, or is it to do with a sort of more, logistical thing, an infrastructure thing that means the messaging can be, or both?
Yeah, I think it's both, but I think primarily it's a question. So there are two elements to this. There is intention and capability. So intention would be political will, recognizing this is a big problem, something needs to be done, and make a decision to do something. And I think there was a big contrast in the US. Of course, we all know during the Trump administration, it wasn't entirely clear that the federal government at the highest levels thought it was a big problem. And I think that's one big. But when it comes to actual results, I think the real difference lies in capability. And here, and I'm more familiar with the US government structure as well as the Chinese government structure. So in the US, there's not a vertical line of political authority from the White House down to any particular neighborhood in the US. So you can have a Republican president, a Democratic governor, perhaps an independent mayor. So the ability to transmit political instructions is not there. Then the ability to actually implement on the ground is not there either. So here it's really because China is a one-party, we can call it an authoritarian system, in that every level of government is directly accountable to the level above it, down to the neighborhood level. So where I live, again, this complex, which in I think many parts of the world could be considered a small town, because there's probably 10,000 people maybe that live in my development. So, and one housing community, maybe hundreds in Beijing, that physical structure of this, which is almost the same as any housing development in China, is that there is every point of access can be controlled. So that usually only two gates open, but during the pandemic, all the gates were closed except one. And again, there was staffing there to check essentially your passport, whether you had a properly dated one and a legitimate resident. But why this can be carried out is every housing development, every neighborhood has a party committee, a Communist Party committee, whose job it is to look after the well-being of the people in the neighborhood. And that can include everything from making sure that elderly people are looked after to, of course, maintaining an element of public security and stability. And one can, I think, reasonably disagree, as I'm sure Ya-Qiu does, that this element of, we could call it perhaps government invasiveness, is something that would be anathema to your average American. But I think it's a legitimate political choice. And it's a choice that China has made and the people overwhelmingly accept. And that type of structure truly shines when there's a true natural disaster or a man-made catastrophe.
Yeah, I can absolutely see it. It's interesting to paint the picture in terms of a housing development. I can sort of imagine the layers of the pyramid, if you like. It kind of helps me to get my head around it. I'd love to know, and I'm going to come back to Yachao in a second to talk about the statistics again when we've heard from Nimo. Might perhaps talk us through the slides in a sec. But Andy, what's the situation now? Like you say, there are flare-ups, aren't there? Little outbreaks and things of the virus. Is it a sort of moving, what we here have called local lockdowns, very different from what you've described? Is that still the policy that you identify an outbreak and very quickly you kind of jump on it, whack-a-mole style?
I think the policy approach has evolved over the last year. So we need to remember that if we roll the clock back to, I don't know, January, February of 2020, no one in the world knew what was going on.
Yeah.
And the outbreak really exploded in Wuhan first. And at that time, again, no one really knew, is this something like an Ebola, right? With
Yeah.
fatality rates, infection rates. So I think the central government decision was that this must be stopped at all costs because we don't know how bad it can be. So mobilized the whole of society, whole of government, whole of society approach, building what 1,000-bed hospitals in days, complete lockdown. You know, the civilian aviation system was all completely shut, if I remember correctly. So, but now what has happened is now there's been a much more sophisticated understanding of COVID. And we have to see with these variants whether it'll be very different. But now, rather than this more sledgehammer approach of locking down a whole city, which also happened maybe about 6 months ago when there were flare-ups in Dongbei, in northeastern China. Whole cities were tested and locked down. Now I think the government or the system has the confidence and the experience that a more targeted, so scalpel versus a sledgehammer in
Right.
that neighborhood is isolated. And I think we cannot ignore the fact too that China is such a digital society. So everyone, of course, has a smartphone, and that smartphone also is a tracking device. So it's used for access to shopping centers, office buildings, schools. So you have to show your health app status, which can show whether you've been in areas that have been infected. So I think because of the information, because of the experience, and I think also the treatment as well, that there's perhaps less fear of how bad COVID can be.
Mm-hmm.
There's a more sophisticated and nuanced approach today, which is very, very different from more than a year ago when it first.
Well, I'd love to come back to you to talk about those treatment options, because again, earlier in the pandemic, we were very, very focused on finding a vaccine for a prevention, but we talked less about sort of treatments and therapies and things like that. Perhaps it's 25 past one. It's a good time probably for me to go to Nimo to just talk through the data, Nimo, and then I'm going to come to Yaqiao to talk a little bit more about the statistics. So Nimo, what have you found out? How does the land lie at the moment?
Well, so hi everyone. So this first slide is the official death statistics coming out from the country. So what they have reported that, the death rates in their countries from COVID. And as you can see, China is very much at like the lowest rate, 5,179. I've just kind of randomly picked a few countries, and right on the polar opposite, almost like, by 10 times more, like 100 times more is America with 592,000 deaths and counting. And you can see just like how difficult it can be to wrap your head around how the vast difference basically in the death rates, especially when you compare population sizes as well. Can we get the next slide? So one of the things that I have been reading about is basically post-SARS. There is a memory in China and about what happened in 2003, whereas we really haven't had anything like that in the UK. Basically, in 2009, the Chinese government made a commitment to, as a result of what happened in 2003, create accessible health coverage for every single person. That was their commitment. In like 2003, very few people had like kind of health coverage in terms of percentages. As you can see here, 2006, 45% of the total population were covered. By 2018, that was 97.5%. Now virtually all people have basic health coverage. Yeah, so can we get the next slide? Yeah, and this is just kind of a graph to kind of show just how like exponentially the health coverage kind of when it trebled in the space of a decade. Get the next slide. Here's another thing. So the peaks, China versus the US. As you can see here, China peaked, quite early, obviously, because that's where the outbreak began. And we can see here that the peak of China versus the peak of US is insanely different.
sorry, Nimo, this is overall COVID deaths, not cases?
This is cases, this one here.
Oh, this is cases.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is kind of to kind of show how, I think this kind of explicates how the Chinese government kind of quickly cracked down and dealt with the cases, as opposed to the US, which there were obviously like lots of mistakes that were made in terms of, do we believe it? Is it going to be dealt with? You know, Trump kind of saying that it was going to be like vanish like a miracle. And then this happened, this kind of steep increase. Yeah. And then the final slide. Can we get it? Yeah. So, but obviously, as has been mentioned earlier, there has been this other side where people have been questioning the data that has been coming out of China. There has been a lot of questions about censorship, about the efficacy of the data, whether it's reliable, whether, for all kinds of different reasons, and various various organizations have kind of come up with their own statistics that could potentially show that, the statistics aren't quite what they seem. And this slide was just a way to kind of show and indicate that the level of censorship and the level of secrecy that was kind of happening at the time, where people who did talk about coronavirus were silenced in some ways. And, that can go from anything by the local police knocking on your door and asking you what you're doing, taking away your personal properties, and cutting you off from the internet. So whilst there definitely is something to be learned about the ways in which the Chinese government obviously handled things in those early stages, it has to be kind of looked at from the lens of, this is still an authoritarian country that has a history of secrecy when it comes to their data and what it is exactly that they kind of show to the world. And for the most part, other data that has come out of China, people usually look at as an indicator as opposed to actual accurate measurements. So COVID is probably no different.
Interesting. Thanks so much, Nimo. Sorry, I just muted myself there because there are some very frightening sounds coming out of these air conditioning pipes above me. It really felt like there was going to be an almighty waterfall coming through the ceiling. So my apologies. Yachao, Nimo's obviously talked about, maybe it's a Western thing, but to what extent can we really believe that most extraordinary number, the 5,179 overall COVID deaths, given a country this enormous size, huge population? Arguably, it happened there first, so the least time to prepare. To what extent can we really go, wow, yes, this is the number, and therefore we all have to take learnings from how they've managed to deal with it?
Well, I think this time probably it's generally accurate, because I do think the government actually had a good control of the pandemic because of the, I use the word draconian measures. So this time I think it's very much, around that number.
In the ballpark.
Of course, that is not to deny that the Chinese government has a history of secrecy. Like, a good example is the 2012, there's a train crash in Wenzhou. And then the government said, I think 60 something people died. And then the population said, 200 people died. At that time, China was much freer. So, you can say, have more space to say what you want to say on the internet. So even in that scenario, there was never a conclusive number how many people died. It's just one train crash. And it's not like COVID. Somebody could die from COVID, or somebody could die from the lack of access to health because of other diseases. So it's such an easy, measurable thing. The government couldn't come up with a number that can convince people. And then there are many earthquake or other diseases that, the government has as Nimo was saying, has a history of concealing things. But I think this time, based on what my communication with people on the ground, I think is generally true.
The number is an extraordinary number, regardless. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I just respond to what Andy was talking about, the government's the ability to institute certain kind of measures. I think I mentioned earlier is yes, the government are able to do that and can suppress it can effectively implement those measures that have good results. But again, it's people can't have a say in this. I mean, I live in the United States. and the control of the COVID was horrible. I disagree. And however, I still have control of my life because people are not wearing masks and everybody was arguing stupid things, but I can control my life in the way that I can stay at home. I can have, food delivered to me. So even it's horrible outside, I can control my life. I can stay safe the way I wanted to do it. And people in China, they have no choice to do that. I'm not agreeing with the American way of COVID response, but just to mention that people can have say in how they wanted to deal with the situation. And this is as a human being, it's so much about about how you wanted to live your life and how everybody wants dignity, and that's part of having a dignified life.
Absolutely. I'm going to bring in a couple of good points and questions from people in the room that perhaps either Yachi or Andy might respond to. Duncan Mavin, who's a new member of the Tortoise family. Are you there, Duncan? Duncan, are you there?
Hi, yeah, I am.
Hey, hello.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about, in a lot of the criticism of the US response and the UK response, I guess, has been focused on this idea that locking down meant kind of compromising on the economy. And so I was kind of wondering if we're saying China locked down really fast, didn't they have the same concern? Like, wouldn't they also be concerned about a huge impact on our economy? So is there something else there that meant that in China there was a reason to lock down, even though the impact on the economy could be really big?
Yeah, it's a good question. Andy, what do you think? We all the way through, we've been in the UK particularly, we've been talking about this sort of seesaw. There's we need to obviously minimize the public health impact of COVID, but then there are public health and economic impacts that are really significant too. How did that play out in China?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that we can look at this, certainly talk about it at that level of this trade-off between economic impact and public health. But I think it's also useful to think about it at a deeper level. And here it is a question of political priorities. And I would make the argument that the Chinese system, even though it is in some ways authoritarian, maybe even draconian, is actually a much more humane system than Western liberal democracies. And the reason for that is that first, if we think about what are truly human rights, at the top of the pyramid, I think would be individual choice, freedom of speech, these types of things that Western organizations focused on human rights tend to almost exclusively focus on. And again, I think this is just because the West has become a victim of its success, in that it was really centuries ago that it conquered the problems of physical existence, food, shelter, clothing. Whereas for China, these challenges were not that long ago, still very real threats to life. So that the Communist Party of China, first focuses on the physical well-being of the people, including safety, of which public health is one. Then economics are the next, or maybe the mid-level of the pyramid, and then individual dignity and dependence is the apex of the pyramid. And I think that the communist system in China places the good of the people first, and that this is partly, I think, because of its political ideology, but also partly because of the Confucian heritage of thousands of years of China's culture and values, being more of a communal society versus an individual society. So I think this accounts for a large part of not worrying as much about the economic or the business impact, because again, it was seen that this could be very, very bad in number of deaths, number of other negative health impacts, and that this needed to be addressed. The other part I want to add here too, that is a very stark difference from a place like the US, is because it is one centralized system, the government can allocate resources from one part of the country to another part of the country almost overnight. whether that's doctors, whether that's construction workers, whether that's money. And I think that's also a very powerful advantage of the Chinese system, in addition to the values of being more humane.
And it's fascinating. I wonder if I could ask you specifically, when we were talking before, you mentioned about how people were then gradually able to move around a little bit differently. You mentioned the role of the smartphone in that, and a couple of people have mentioned quickly deployed effective technology solutions to help facilitate that more scalpel-like approach to lockdown. Now, in the UK, I don't know the extent to which you're aware, but test and trace has been an entirely different experience for us, and we've had lots of conversations at Tortoise about, you know, people being willing or unwilling to share their data. The app just doesn't work. You know, it's not been the same experience at all. Would you just mind telling us a little bit about the role of technology in the sort of last 12 months or so in managing Chinese response? Because we've not had a good experience on the technology front.
Yes. No, I think there's two aspects to this. I think one is that the notions of Western style human rights can also be quite dysfunctional. You know, I think the instance you mentioned where people might object because of perceived privacy issues is one. The other is, I think it also comes back to government and the relationship between government and society, where in places like the US, I think the UK as well, business enterprises and government are seen as perhaps peers. Of course, in some ways, when it comes to criminal law, other types of law enforcement, the government is at a higher level than business. But in many other ways, they're seen as peers, or even businesses being in some sense superior to government. And in China, clearly, it doesn't matter who you are. You know, you can be a major tech company like an Alibaba, and it's very clear the government is in charge. So I think what this leads to then, there's 2 points to this I think it's important to make for our audience to understand, is one, that when the government makes a decision, everyone falls into line to make sure it happens, whether it's a tech company, whether it's you know, small business or other type of organization. The other is the competence of government. So as Ya-Qiu knows, to join the government in China, you have to take an exam, and it's actually harder to get into the Chinese government than it is to get into Harvard. I think there's a 1%, 2% acceptance rate for people that take the civil service exam. So the quality of the individuals, I think, is much higher. The emphasis on competence very high as well. If you remember the stimulus payments that were made at the beginning of the response to the economic impact of the COVID outbreak in the US, many people, there were several senators, I believe might have been Tom Cotton or Marco Rubio, said, we can't expect the government to be able to issue that many checks and have everybody get them, right? And there's a joke in the US that people say good enough for government work, right? Meaning that, you know, mediocrity is about what we can accept from government. Whereas I think the Chinese people would never accept mediocrity from the government, and the government has to perform at a very high level. And it's because of this, I think, that we can see the effectiveness of these apps.
Thanks. Ya-Qiu, I can see you pulling this face a little bit as Andy's talking. Do you want to respond a bit to some of those things?
Well, I think it comes down, I mean, Andy mentions 2 points. One is that people fall in line when the government you know, wants to do certain things. Well, I think that's a result because people cannot fall in line, because if you criticize, if you disagree, well, you get visited by the police, or worse, if you keep disagreeing, you go to jail. And another issue in terms of the competence of the you know, the government, people expect the government has a high level of competence. First of all, well, I think the government is not as competent, you know, in a lot of ways, is not as competent as what the government says. If you read Chinese social media, you can see a lot of people complaining. And as again, this is just tip of iceberg, because most people would not dare to complain. You know, they can get harassed, or worse, they can get jailed. Well, I think, you know, secondly, I mean, like, people expected the government to have high level of competence? I don't necessarily think that, because if you already know that, you cannot criticize government, then, like what kind of expectation you can have in terms of, that, criticizing the government. I think my point is that the question itself, the assertion that people have high expectation is already kind of forced, because you actually have no say in terms of, you cannot criticize the government. Sorry, I'm losing my.
Actually, if I can jump in and respond to what Yachi is saying, because I can understand why she says this, but I think it's not accurate. It is true that public criticism, especially on social media, is generally not seen as a good thing in China. But we need to recognize that there are other forms that are perhaps more effective ways of providing feedback. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So I'm fortunate that I do have the chance to interact with both national level, ministry level government officials down to municipal, city, and chu, or would be district level officials. There is a hotline that citizens can call to complain about government behavior, whether that is bad policies or just a bad attitude. If you go to, for a property deed or something like that. So I think the government is actually excessively sensitive to public opinion and worked very hard to not only understand what the complaints are, but to react to them in an effective manner. If we talk about competence, yes, clearly you look at the government or the party with about 90 million members, which is larger than the population of the UK. Managing an organization, in having uniform standards of conduct, et cetera, is a very difficult thing. And I think that's well recognized, and statements are made by various levels of party leadership that this needs to be improved. It's a never-ending task. But when we look at how well the government is doing, think about things as basic as public safety. So in Beijing, you can walk anywhere without worrying about your physical safety, day or night. 2 a.m. in the morning, you can walk anywhere. I'm not so sure that's true of New York or maybe other major cities in the world. You look at the state of the streets. They're clean, they're well maintained. Increasingly in Beijing, they're also very green. They're landscaped, regularly watered. The schools are generally considered high quality.
Andy, forgive me for interrupting. I take the point that you're making about the system overall. I wonder if I might pick up on a question that Duncan asked, which I think is a really good point. It comes back to this thing we were talking about earlier, to do with how quickly the Chinese government understood really quickly the potential seriousness of the COVID situation, and other governments around the world did not, grasp as early on, and the consequences of delaying and dithering with whatever lockdown you were going to do were significant. I wonder, one of the other sort of themes we've looked at taught us a lot is this question of the relationship between how it works in this country. There's the government, and then there's a set of sort of scientific advisors, if you like, who the government depend on to say, what do we know and what don't we know yet, and how do we manage things in between. And the sort of evolution of that scientific understanding of COVID in this country has been something that's been a source of ongoing controversy. The quality of the scientific advice, the extent to which the government took it, all of those things, are evolving. I wonder if, because the Chinese government obviously took a call very quickly when Wuhan, the situation has started happening, it's sort of almost like, why? I take your point about, well, public health is an enormous priority in China, much more so than economic considerations. I understand the sort of cultural context, but I wonder about the specific disease-related context, is it your sense that the government knew how dangerous the disease was in a way that the rest of us didn't quite realize?
Perhaps. So I, again, would bring this back to the quality of the government officials and their competence and incentives as well. Because there are no elections and it's not a multi-party system in the way it is in places like the UK or the US, the attention of a government official can be undivided. So when we think about multi-party democracies, think about the humorous novel and TV show, Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, right? Every government official has to view every event, every decision, not only from the public good perspective, but from their political party's perspective and their election chances, right? So when we think about whether you're a senior decision maker, you're a senior business executive, or you're a government minister, the most important resource you have is your mental energy and your emotional energy and attention. So to the degree that that's diverted by thinking about other factors, only undermine the quality of those decisions. And then we add to that, in a place like the US, the increasing political polarization that strengthening your tribe or undermining the opposite tribe is probably more important to you than the public good. And I think these are problems that China does not have. And this can lead to, I think, a more objective evaluation of real world problems versus political ones.
Andy, how's the vaccination program? I mean, I can't even, 1.4 billion people having to be vaccinated. That's a big task. What's the state of play on the vaccines in China?
Yeah, I think it's going well. I think that's one of the goals, is to have universal vaccination, and that's happening. There have been no, as far as I'm aware, maybe Yatu or other people here know something else, but as far as I'm aware, it's not compulsory at this point. It's offered. Frontline doctors, nurses, other people, I think that might have been compulsory. I'm not sure, but certainly it's been available, readily available. I think the goal is to have everyone vaccinated as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Chao, I just wonder if you want to come back on any of the points that Andy has made, but also this, if overall the reason why we're trying to understand why that extraordinary 5,179 number is the number that it is, and to try and take from that learnings for the rest of us, for obvious reasons, lifting and shifting a Chinese way of living and trying to drop it in other parts of the world, that's, we can't do that. And I think it feels very uncomfortable for us Western people who rather like our liberty. Thank you very much. What do you think we can take from some of the things that Andy has been sharing about how China works? Because we certainly don't want to take all of it in terms of pandemic preparedness.
Well, I think first of all, people like to compare the US and China. I live in the US. I don't like a lot of things going on in this country. So, I mean, we need to shift our attention, just, looking in the US, right? I mean, there are countries who are democracies are doing fine. Australia, Korea, Taiwan, those, people consented to the measures put on them. The officials make the decisions are, elected. So basically, there are input from the people and they decide together, we wanted to have those kind of measures on us because we want, safety and we don't want to die from it. I mean, I think generally the comparison with the US is it's like, I don't think that's a good, like the other side of a story to look at. I mean, in terms of what, things we can take good things about China, I think, I don't know whether to what extent is good. I think there is a lot of compliance with government rules was based on that people know that they cannot fight back. So in a way, you kind of rationalize your life because well, if there's no way I can resist this kind of control on me, then I start to rationalize maybe it's not that bad. I mean, this COVID thing turns out, in a lot of ways, it benefited a lot of people. My family was not living in Wuhan, so they were like, I think people in Wuhan were traumatized, I would say, just, not about people who died or who was infected. Generally, the people in the city were traumatized. But if you ask my family, they would say, the government did the right thing because I'm far from Wuhan, right? So I benefited from it. So again, the point is that compliance, which I think is good overall, like there's just so much unnecessary resistance in the US. But this was based on people know that they cannot not comply.
Thanks, Xiaoqiao. Perhaps I'll bring in a couple of people from the room who've been listening, and it's been absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much to both of you. Yelena, you were sort of reflecting aloud about how much should we obsess about sort of what's gone before and causes and things like that, and whether that's a sort of helpful thing to look at in the media, or whether we should just be focused on what now.
Yeah, I think for me, I've just found it interesting because I've been following the story about the lab leak theory.
Yeah.
And I just wonder how constructive it is to be looking at causes. I think it's obviously very important and it needs to be part of wider COVID inquiries that we're doing. But in terms of tackling the current crisis that we're facing, the fact that we still have issues in hospitals with the vaccine, with all of these other very present issues, I wonder how constructive it is to be looking back so much. And I mean that in terms of our media coverage. I thought that was really interesting, actually, what Andy was saying about this notion of there being no distraction because you're focusing entirely on the political now. And I wonder how much that should inform our approach to reporting and what we choose to look at in the media right now.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks so much, Yelena. And then Kenneth Lawton has just now made, I think, a really interesting question. Kenneth, because when we've been looking at our sadly huge numbers of people who've died from this disease, we've obviously, in the sample size, we've got a lot to think about in terms of people who were particularly vulnerable and all those kinds of comorbidities that you've talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I come to this with a background in general practice. I'm retired now, but I've watched this epidemic with great interest and watched the way the world has coped with it. I think when you look at the statistics in the UK, it is very much this very elderly who are dying from COVID. And I just wonder if one of the major markers for difference between China and ourselves are more health related rather than culturally related issues. So much less diabetes, much less obesity, better diets in general, and age and frailty. Yep, there is an old population in China, but they tend to be very, very healthy.
Interesting.
Whereas our older folk have up to 8 comorbidities by the time they're into their 80s.
Thanks so much, Kenneth. That's a really interesting point, Andy. And Nimo's analysis looked at sort of public healthcare and coverage and things and how much better that's got in China. But Kenneth makes the point that very quickly we learned in the UK that this was a disease that was predominantly affecting older people and men, and that there were other associated health risk factors to do with heart disease and diabetes and being overweight and things like that that would make you more vulnerable. Is overall the Chinese population more well, if that's a sensible question, than the Western?
No, it's a very good question. My understanding is that this is a complex phenomenon, that obesity, diabetes, some of these diseases are in some sense diseases of development. So as per capita incomes rise, diets start shifting, and we are seeing, especially among younger people in China, greater incidence of obesity. So
right.
I think that there is a rise in these types of chronic illnesses that correlate with economic development. So I think it's a complex question, but certainly historically, the Chinese diet, I think, was very different from the modern American diet that is high in processed foods, sucrose, things like this. So I don't think I have a very conclusive answer to that. I do want to respond very, very quickly to a point that Yatu made about Chinese people feeling they have no choice in being fatalistic. That may not be completely untrue, but I think we should also not ignore the role of history and culture, because China is, after all, still very much a Confucian culture, and where you think about obedience to parents, obedience to teachers. And this is a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, this has held back many Chinese people that come from a Confucian culture like Japan and maybe Korea as well, that they don't do as well in the West because they're seen as passive or too obedient. And that I would not entirely say that the reason why people listen to the government in China is because they've given up. But I think there is also a tradition of obedience, is the first point. The second point, though, is that, which is maybe different or opposite to this one, is that the people here are very, very practical and very quick to express their discontent. And I think largely everyone is very happy. And I'll give you one quick number. So Shenzhen's GDP increased by 10,000-fold in the 40 years since the beginning of economic reform. And this is a number that can be hard to wrap your mind around, but imagine that if 40 years ago you were making 10,000 pounds a year, if it increased by 10,000 times, that means you would be making 100 million pounds a year. That is the magnitude of the increase, the improvement in people's lives in really one generation. So I think this, to me, accounts more for why the Communist Party of China enjoys such overwhelming support.
Thank you so much. It's been a completely fascinating hour. I confess I was rather nervous stepping in at the last minute when James was called away. But I've got an enormous amount out of it. I've learned a ton. So thank you sincerely to Andy for an hour out of your evening, Andy, and to Yachao for an hour out of your morning. Andy can go off and have dinner, and Yachao go and have some breakfast. It's been really, really fascinating. And thank you very much to everybody who has joined us this lunchtime. We will return to this type of conversation. We have another conversation next week about China and the way that China, and particularly big Chinese companies and organizations, are working with and inside of British universities and scientific development and so on and so forth. That's a week today at lunchtime, and then another one later on this month that is specifically looking at the origins of COVID. So thank you very much to everybody for joining us. Have a lovely rest of the day, and however much of it there is left. But Andy, not very much, but Yachao, the whole thing. So thank you very much indeed, and all the best. Bye-bye.